back to Storytime with Dave Booker. I appreciate you coming back. I apologize for the delay in these readings. It's been a while, but had a little problem and my eyes are not as good as they were. So I'm going to be going back to reading, but I'm going to have to do it off the computer. And that way I can blow it up large enough to see, and I can still show you the book, which is right here. So that's what we're going to be reading today, is Sheriff in a Small Town. And I've been reading a couple of chapters from the version I'm working on now. Not version, but the second volume. But apparently, either I have deleted the originals or I never did them, which I find that hard to believe. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start Sheriff in a Small Town and work our way through, and maybe we'll read all the stories. I'll keep them on there for maybe 1, 2, 3 months, maybe a little bit longer, and then we're going to delete them. And that way you'll have to buy the book. So let's begin with Chapter 1, Rocky Reporter Gets His First Scoop. The editor-in-chief of the Logan Sentinel leaned out of his office. "Hey, Rocky, get your tape recorder and camera and head out over the old jail on Newark Street. They're closing it down and moving the dead. See what you can dig up on it from the files, and then check with folks who turn up. Might be able to get a personal angle from a few." He watched with approval as Rocky Stone, his newest reporter, leapt from his desk, banging his knee in the process. From a drawer, he grabbed his recorder and the camera. Checking there was tape in the recorder and film in the camera, he headed out. He pulled on his navy coat and his old Greek fisherman's cap off the peg, and placing it at a jaunty angle, rushed out the door. Nelson went back into his office and looked over the list of events for today, marking off who would cover what. Taking a pull at his pipe, he patted himself on the back for hiring Rocky at such short notice. Good kid, fresh out of the Army. Rocky never had said what he had done or where he had been. He seemed as if he wanted to put his time in the Army behind him. Well, there was something about him, though, that Nelson liked and trusted. Rocky had been born and raised here in town, and once his 6 years were up, he'd come back home looking for work. Liking the open, friendly face and friendly professional demeanor, he had been accepted immediately. Nelson felt sure that with time, Rocky would become his star reporter. He had industry, and was the personable sort who people felt comfortable talking to. Stepping into the street, Rocky breathed deeply of the crisp morning air. The jail wasn't far and the day pleasant. He decided to walk. It was 2 blocks down Quincy Street, turned right onto Jarvis Avenue and another 2 blocks down, then left onto Haskins past an open expanse of ground rafts and boulders. An imposing edifice built in the Gothic style that still gave him the chills every time he drove past it. He approached the building with a sense of disquiet. He walked up to the chain-link fence that bordered the property. The fence had concertina wire on the top and was buried 3 feet deep down at the bottom. Through the fence, he saw another about 3 feet from this one. He brought out his camera and snapped a couple of pictures showing a group of people standing around as workmen dug down into the graves and pulled out the caskets. Some of these had to be wrapped in canvas first and then laid on a sling to be raised. Once on the surface, the remains, or what remained of the remains, were transferred to a new coffin. The name of the individual written on a card, and the card tacked to the top of the casket. Finally, the casket would be loaded onto a flatbed for transport to the plot of land designated for reburial. During his time in the Army, he had seen sights far worse than this, but somehow this semi-resurrection of bodies made him slightly nauseous. As usual, he caught on a sense of humor to relax him. Rocky pulled the collar of his navy pea coat up and tapped the cop at the gate on the shoulder. Officer Woodward of the State Corrections Bureau turned round and frowned when he came face to face with the man in a pea coat, upside down Greek fisherman's hat, eyes crossed, a cigarette in his ear, and smoke coming out of his nose. Rocky held out his press badge. Rocky, you have got to be one of the craziest reporters at the Sentinel. Rocky retrieved the cigarette and took a drag. I got a covered move. Mind if I slide inside? Officer Woodward opened the gate and let him pass. Rocky snapped a few pictures of the building and more long shots of the bodies raising from the pit. As he edged closer to the cemetery, he turned around to take a shot of a blanked-out window. Behind that darkened glass, he determined that probably was where the death chamber was. Part of his indoctrination to the paper had been to read back copies. Amongst the pages, he read about the many cases that had ended up in that forbidding room. He stood and stared as images of hangings and electrocutions flashed through his mind. One in particular recurred over and over. A man, slight of build and with a shock of red hairs, being led to the chair. A priest mumbles a prayer that is barely audible. It is meant to comfort the condemned. Its purpose is lost on the young man in the chair. In Rocky's mind, he could smell the burning flesh and hear the crackle of electricity. The young man's body contorts in the chair as the current pours through him. He slumps and is carried away. He sees a young wife nearby, her eyes red with tears, and a boy of 4 years old clinging to her skirt. His eyes are also red, but there is a firmness in his stance and purpose in his stare. The image has been burned into his memory to be carried with him the rest of his life. A tap on Rocky's shoulder brought him out of his reverie. He turned to look upon a young man with red hair, beard, and mustache. He was tall and slightly built. His mouth seemed as if it was usually held in grim lines, but his smile was pleasant enough, as he too looked up at the darkened pane. I saw you looking up there and wondered what held your interest so long. Rocky shook the images from his mind. It's the execution chamber. I was kind of seeing it in my mind. I saw a flash of people going to their death. The man took a pull at his pipe and then looked from the window to the graveyard. I've been there and saw for myself. I'm here to watch them move my dad to his new home. He turned and walked to the grave that they were just starting to open. Rocky joined him. Hey, I'm a reporter for the Sentinel. Mind talk with me a bit? The red-headed man looked at Rocky and seemed as though he was trying to take the measure of him. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know that anyone would want to hear what I got to say, though. Rocky brought out his recorder and double-checked the tape. You said no one would want to hear what you have to say? Well, I do. The man leaned against a post and his eyes took on a mile-long stare. Now, this is where my dad is buried. He had just turned 25 and his birthday was spent on death row. Me and my mom were brought in to see him die. Die in the electric chair. I can still hear my dad calling to me, son, I swear I'm innocent. Don't you ever doubt that. Well, I never did. They said they killed a woman and buried her out in the field. The minute finished digging, the man peered down at the casket. My dad and I used to go to that self-same field and bring our dog to chase sticks. There was a clump of trees that hid a small grassy area. One day our dog chased the ball into it and started howling, scratching at the pile of freshly dug earth there. Dad didn't like the way Russ was barking, so he had me stand behind a big oak to wait while he and Russ checked it out. They scraped away together till they uncovered a woman. I went over to the tree and that was on the edge of the plot. I was peeking around from around the tree and saw her when Dad rolled her over. Her head was bashed in on the right, as though she'd been hit with a bat or something. She couldn't have been dead long because blood was still fresh. Got on Dad's arm and hand. I saw the sheriff's car pull up and the deputy turned on those lights and pulled his gun on Dad. Dad got up slowly, motioning me to stay put. Russ was growling at the deputy and the deputy shot him. Dad had his hands out in front of him, and the next thing I know, Dad was on the ground on his face, and the deputy was cuffing him and half dragging him into the squad car. The man pulled a handkerchief out of a back pocket and wiped his brow. I ran home and had to wait until my mom got home. When she came in, I was still crying, but eventually got out that Dad had been taken to jail. He paused as he heard the chunk of metal on wood. The trial was so short, it couldn't have even been called a trial. We couldn't afford a lawyer, and the one they gave Dad wasn't much good. Not his fault, as they pushed it through real fast. Hell, it was over before we knew it. The look on my dad's face was one I'll never forget. He was set to go to the chair on the 23rd of March, his birthday. The deputy came and got us to go see it. I sat in the same car on the same side, looking out the same window Dad had. They took us up to the second floor, and we stood at the side behind a guardrail. Like I said, I knew my dad was innocent. He wouldn't hurt anybody except to protect us. No one ever listened. We've been trying for years to clear his name. Still trying to clear it. Can't say I've gotten any closer after all these years. He stood as the casket came out of the earth. Rocky recognized that there wasn't much wrong with the casket. It had to be one of the last ones to be laid in. The casket was labeled and placed on the end and edge of the flatbed. See you soon, Dad, the man said as he touched the wood. Pulling a dark green Greek fisherman's hat out of a pocket, he placed it on his head. He was walking away when he turned and hollered for Rocky. Hey, mister, why don't you come with me? Mom and me will give you a bit of dinner. Price is right, and you won't find better. Rocky held up a hand indicating he'd be with him in a moment. He found his story and wasn't going to let it slip away. Rocky finished off his roll of film and joined his new companion. As they passed Officer Woodward, they heard him laughing. Both turned at the sound. Sorry, fellas, but you two could pass as family. It was only then that they realized the similarity in their coats and hat. Both were of similar height and weight. Rocky extended his hand. The name's Rocky Stone. Pleased to make your acquaintance. His new friend reached out and grasped Rocky's hand in a firm grip. Mine's Joe Steckler. Nice to meet you. They walked down Leeward Street for a few blocks, chatting casually as if they were already old friends. At the corner of Leeward and Windward, Joe led them up the steps into the porch of a small home. Joe opened the front door and shouted that he had company. From inside, Rocky heard the clatter of heels over wood. Mrs. Steckler opened the screen door wide from a welcoming gesture. Joe led Rocky into a fairly Spartan living room with an old couch and a couple of metal folding chairs in front of a wood table that looked as if it had been made out of wood crates. A Crosley radio stood on the top of shelf of the bookcase, playing Benny Goodman softly in the background. On a shelf was an ornately framed diploma from Joe graduating high school not long ago. And from the look of the frame, his mother was immensely proud of him. Rocky was seated comfortably on the dilapidated couch, and Joe sat on one of the chairs. Mrs. Steckler brought up coffee and cake and set them on the table. Looking at Rocky, she gradually seemed to relax. Joe leaned back in a chair with his coffee cupped in his hands. Ma, I've been telling Rocky here about Dad and that we've been trying for years to clear his name. He thinks he might be able to help us. Rocky held up his hand. I said I'm willing to look into it and do some research. With the access I have, I might be able to stir something up. I just don't want you to pin all your hopes on me. Mrs. Steckler seemed to grow smaller than her 5'3" as she huddled miserably in her chair. Rocky rose and stood behind, putting a sympathetic hand on her shoulders. Squatting beside her chair, he looked into her eyes. Sorry, I didn't mean that to sound harsh, but it might take a while to get what we need. We'll get it, though. I'll work on this as much as possible, and when we're ready, really ready, with absolute proof will break your story wide open. We might even be able to find the real murderer. Miss Steckler's face turned pale as she laid a hand on his shoulder. Leaning on it, she raised herself and walked unsteadily into the kitchen to put the finishing touches to dinner. You know, it might help to see what you've done so far. That way I can fill in what blanks are missing. Rocky sat back down as Joe reached under the couch for a long, thin dress box. From inside, he pulled a couple of old yellow newspapers, a transcript of the trial, and the death certificate. Rocky leaned back onto the couch and read of what was known about Joe's father while Joe headed out to set the table. Excerpts from the Logan Sentinel, June 15, 1928. Local Sheriff's Deputy Hank Lester apprehended Mr. Joseph P. Steckler. Mr. Steckler is accused of the murder of Ms. Laura Holmes, 22. She was reported missing by her mother at 14:30 on June 13th after not returning from a morning walk. June 16, 1928. Mr. Joseph P. Steckler has been remanded for trial on June 20th. His court-appointed lawyer has already announced that they will be pleading innocent and that there is no proof as to the guilt of his client. He is concerned with the speed with which the prosecutor is driving this trial at the insistence of the sheriff's office under the direction of Deputy Warren Lester. Sheriff Morgan is still in New Falls on extended duty. Deputy Lester has been unavailable for interview but has issued the following statement. Mr. Steckler was apprehended in the act of digging a hole preparatory for burying the corpus. Mrs. Holmes was only recently dead as the blood was still seeping from the head wound. From these facts, we have no doubt as to the verdict of the jurors. June 20th. Excuse me. The trial of Joseph P. Steckler was widely attended today, and the hall was filled to capacity. The prosecution's only witness was Deputy Lester. Deputy Lester was performing his drive around town when he approached Soldier Field and saw the accused after having dug a hole in the process of burying the body of Miss Holmes. Miss Holmes had been a close acquaintance of the deputy, and he broke down in tears when he described the finding of her body. He quickly recovered himself and gave the rest of his evidence with a firm voice. Mr. Steckler took the stand and spoke of having brought his dog to the field, and while there, the dog started digging in the earth and whining. Mr. Steckler had assisted in digging and discovered the body buried in the shallow grave. He had pulled the body out and had laid it on the ground when Deputy Lester had her driven by. Deputy Lester immediately placed him in custody and charged him with the murder of Miss Holmes. Upon cross-examination as to why, once he had discovered the body, he had not immediately contacted the sheriff's office instead of disturbing the scene, he answered that since there was still blood seeping from the wound, it might be possible to revive her. Dr. Mortimer was called next and gave it as his opinion that the deceased had been dead between 10 and 20 minutes, and that death was caused by blunt force trauma to the cranium. The jury deliberated for half an hour and rendered a verdict of guilty. Judge Splicer agreed with the verdict, and Mr. Steckler was sentenced to death by electric chair on the 23rd. Rocky put down the papers and looked up as Joe re-entered the room. Seems to me that the trial was pushed through awful quick. Joe nodded. Yeah, that's what we think. Personally, I believe the deputy had something to do with it, but I can't prove it. He just seemed to be too Johnny on the spot somehow. Besides, he knew her and might have had a falling out with her or resented it. Rocky drank off his cup of cold coffee and was ushered into the dining room. Over a dinner of homemade noodles and beef shank, they started working out a plan of attack. Rocky made a list of the people involved and who knew who, as well as the facts of or what was considered facts. The small town of Comfort, Ohio was a very small one, and he felt that with time and patience he might be able to uncover some new ground. Leaning back in his chair, he complimented Mrs. Steckler on dinner. She smiled at him. We don't have a lot, but we make do and get by. Joe patted his mother's shoulders on his way to the kitchen with a stack of bowls. Mom could make a cardboard box into a feast and you'd never notice it was cardboard. Rocky ticked off his notes and asked Mrs. Steckler about some of the people on his list. Do you know Miss Holmes? Her face frowned and he could see the muscles of her wrist tighten as she clenched the arm of the chair. I knew of her. Everyone knew of her. She was a little flirt is what she was. If it wore slacks, she'd bat her eyes and swivel her hips at him. Rocky was surprised at the vehemence as she spat out her words. She was stringing along Deputy Lester, but that didn't mean she was his exclusive. She had plenty of fish on a hook, and it weren't any secret who she kept dangling. Rocky made a note and asked about the deputy. He was all right as far as being a deputy goes, a little too zealous if you ask me, and too cocksure of himself. When Sheriff Morgan was off somewhere, I think the shock of seeing Shirley dead in front of Joe was what made him treat Joe so bad, made him push the trial real quick. Joe spent a little while more with them, then politely took his leave. Joe saw him to the door. Don't think too much about what Ma said. She never liked Sue Holmes. She felt that sooner or later she'd hit on Pa. Dad wouldn't have gone off with her, though, and she knows it. She just didn't like that kind of fast woman. I appreciate you taking this on. If you need me, I've reopened Dad's filling station and auto repair. Mom kept it for me, and I've been able to make money for us again. The men shook hands, and Rocky sauntered down the street. He had a few more hours of work ahead of him, so he went to the Sentinel to talk over the story with his boss. I think there might be a story in this somewhere. I'll do the write-up about the closing of the jail, but I'd like to give this a little play as well. Should tug at the heartstrings a bit. Man wrongly placed on death row for a murder he didn't commit, family destitute, son having a hard time getting customers as the son of a murderer. What do you say? Nelson leaned back in his chair, his hands behind his head. I don't see why not. I'll give you a couple of weeks to work on this exclusive. If after 2 weeks you don't have anything, you'll have to go give it up and get back to work on regular stories. Deal? Rocky stood and clasped his boss's hand. Deal. Bet you a steak dinner that I could either prove his guilt or find who did it. Nelson shook his head. Making a catfish shrine, you got a bet. As Rocky sat at his desk to type out a story about the jail move, he devoted a portion of his mind to the task he had agreed to. Mentally, he made notes of a plan of attack. Let's see, first thing after I finish this story, I need to get as much on as the settler has about this, the Sentinel has about this. Then talk to Sheriff Lester. Better tread carefully with him. Why was Mrs. S so pissed about Sue? Neither of them said anything about Joseph having been seduced by her. Well, maybe she just didn't like the fast woman and feared he could have been tempted. He finished up his story, placed the roll of film into a canister, and added to the envelope and placed it in the tray. He made his way to the back copies and got out the ones from the trial and everything related to it. In one, he found a picture of Sue Holmes. Well, she was attractive in a Gloria Graham sort of way. She had a kind of dreamy film star look about her, and he could understand how men would be attractive. From what the pages said, she was a well-known personage who had hung around the theaters and bars. He could imagine she never had to buy her own drinks much. He reread the notes of the trial and studied the pictures and side notes Nathan had made while covering the story. During the trial, Joseph Steckler had remained subdued, answering questions in a quiet, though clear voice. He consistently claimed to have found the body and was upset the deputy had shot his dog. The deputy was very vocal and his testimony was very damaging to the defense. He had found the defendant beside an open hole with the body still bleeding in his arms. defendant had a vicious dog as a guardian, and he had to shoot it in self-defense. Yes, he had known the victim was in fact engaged to her. No, that would not have made him unnaturally emotional. He had been in firm control of the entire time and performed his duties with calmness and efficiency. The defense tried to bring the deputy's performance record in, but the prosecutor objected, and the judge agreed that they had no bearing on the facts of the case. When asked how he had gotten to the site so quickly without being summoned, he had stated he was out on patrol. When it was pointed out that the field where the body had been found was in another county's jurisdiction, he responded that the area was border and could rightfully be claimed by either. A thought struck Rocky, and he rechecked everything. Where were the sheriff's comments and opinions? There was nothing here. Surely something of this magnitude would have been enough to bring the sheriff back home. He grabbed a notebook and headed over to Morgan's house. Hold on one second. I want to check and see how far we got till next chapter. Yeah, I thought so. I don't have it broken down in chapters here. Hold on one second. Okay. We're going to stop right here, and we will continue on with this particular chapter probably within the next couple of days, and hopefully I can read from the book. So I will be reading again in a couple of days. Hope you'll come back, and I thank you for watching this and look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a good day. Bye.